Hello and welcome to the Wizard's Nook. In this video, I'll show you how I built this O-scale model out of scrap materials and dollar store foam board. I based it loosely on a photo, but I only built the front section, and I wasn't too exact with the dimensions, except for the doors, which are 1 5/8 inches tall. This was a Christmas present for someone who has an O-scale train layout. I wanted a really solid structure so it could stand up to being handled and moved around and having the occasional caboose dropped on it. So I started with some scraps of chipboard or binder's board left over from another project. It's about 3/32 of an inch thick. I used white PVA glue and reinforced the joints with strips of craft paper. To keep the walls perpendicular till the glue dried, I used this pair of precision weighted ceramic angle guides. I glued small scraps of chipboard behind the doorways so I could set the doors deeper. I left the center of the base open so I can put lights in later. I cut a scrap of poster board to hide the seams on the roof, but since I textured the roof later, this turned out not to be necessary. And it was at this point I realized I'd forgotten to cut window openings. So I marked them out, made openings at the corners with a drill press, and cut them out with a small hobby saw. In retrospect, though, it might have been easier to do this with a Dremel. The stone for the outer walls I made out of a piece of foam board from the dollar store. After cutting out the pieces and peeling the paper off, I used a pencil to outline the stones. I also tried a pen and a couple of other tools, but the pencil seemed to work best for this. I drew in the largest stones and the tops of the windows first, and then went back and filled in the rows of smaller stones. I added some texture with a ball of foil, which is a trick I picked up from pretty much every other crafter on YouTube. In order to hide the seams at the corners, I decided to miter cut the side edges of the foam. Since this foam is pretty flexible, I was able to just hold my knife at an angle and slice. It's not 45 degrees exactly, but it should be close enough. I glued the walls on with more PVA. I put waxed paper around the corners and held them together with weights till the glue dried to close up those gaps. The inner stone surfaces around the roof are also made of foam. Since chipboard would have made the walls too thick, I reinforced this area with cardstock hidden between the foam layers. I used acrylic modeling paste to hide the seams at the corners, applying it with a palette knife, and then scraping it out of the mortar joints with a sculpting tool while it was still wet. Once it had dried, I lightly sanded it and then did some final cleanup with a needle file. The tops of the walls were made with strips of chipboard. Cutting this stuff with a knife expands the edges a bit, so I smooth those back down with sandpaper before gluing it on. I added some modeling paste to hide the seams at the rear corners and to give a more stone or concrete-like texture to the top surface, so it'll look less like chipboard. And here's what the model looks like so far. The rounded trim above the doors and windows is made from scraps of mat board. For the steps, I used narrow strips of chipboard. It's too thick to cut with scissors, but for small pieces like this, side cutters or snips work just fine. Here's a closer view of one of the steps. I finished them off with some craft paper to hide the edges. Once the steps were done, I went back to adding woodwork around the doors and windows. I'm just using scraps of mat board left over from picture framing. Next, I covered the doorways with cardstock to hide the layers and make them look like solid wood. Next, I glued small rectangles of mat board inside the door openings, so I'd have something to attach the doors to. The doors themselves are just rectangles of cardstock, with smaller strips glued on to look like panels. I primed everything with a mix of gray paint and matte Mod Podge. I gave the foam a second coat for a little extra protection. Next up were the windows. I used Illustrator to draw out the frames, and I printed these out on cardstock. I just filled an entire page with them, so I would have plenty of spares if I made any mistakes. To build up different thicknesses of trim around the windows, I glued together a double layer and cut out just the outsides of the frames, and then glued this down on top of the first set. So the outer edge is 3 layers thick, and the cross pieces here are just 1 layer. Next, I glued down narrow strips to just the horizontal parts of the cross pieces. This way there are 3 different thicknesses to the window frames. Priming the frames before I cut them apart was easier than trying to handle each of them separately. After cutting the frames apart, I superglued them to clear plastic from the lid of a supermarket sushi container. I lightly sanded the back of the plastic off camera, and then gave it a quick coat of matte Mod Podge to make it a little less transparent. I superglued narrow strips of paper to the backs of the windows so that I could use PVA to install them. PVA won't hold them by itself since it won't stick to this plastic, but superglue melts the foam I used for the walls. After the superglue was dry, I glued in the windows with PVA. The superglue bonds the plastic to the paper, and the PVA bonds the paper to the foam and chipboard. I glued cardstock along the sides and tops of the windows for the final layer of trim, using a sculpting tool to help position it. The windowsills are made from strips of mat board. After I glued these on, I coated them with more PVA as a primer. I'm not sure what this type of roof actually looks like, so I used glue and some old wall grout to make a generic rough surface, sort of like asphalt or gravel. I never use this spoon for food, by the way. I got it at a thrift store to use as a sculpting tool. Once the roof had dried for a few minutes, I brushed off the excess grout and then vacuumed it up. I primed the roof with Mod Podge and black paint. Going back to the windows, I cut some paper to make the top surface of the windowsills. Next, I decided to expand the front step with some chipboard to give the front of the building a little more dimension. I coated both of the steps with modeling paste for a stone-like surface. I used the same paste to fill in the remaining gaps around the windows, applying it with a silicone sculpting tool. A tiny gap here would look natural, but these were just too big for this scale. Finally, I made doorknobs out of a couple of pins that had plastic-coated heads. A little sanding improved the shape. I made tiny holes in the doors with a hand drill and cut the pins short so there wouldn't be any sharp points sticking through into the inside. I used tiny rectangles of cardstock for lock plates and superglued everything in place. And here's a closer look at one of the doors. Once the doors were finished, it was time to paint. I painted the inside of the walls and ceiling with a warm yellow color. This is to give the windows a warm glow when it's lit up from the inside. On the outside, I started by picking out the larger stones with a tan color. These stand out distinctly from the gray right now, but by the time I'm finished, the difference will be pretty subtle, which is exactly what I want. I'm using a combination of artist colors and craft paints, basically whatever kind of paint I already had around. These are all acrylic based, so they can be mixed together. I painted the steps gray, but I kept it uneven so they'd have a more natural look. Next, I mixed up a warm off-white color, wiped most of it off the brush, and went over all the stonework with it. This lightened the stone and started bringing the different colors together while leaving the mortar lines darker. As you might have noticed in the last few shots, the roof turned out lumpy and uneven, so I sanded it down off camera to level it out. Since I'm not sure what the real roof is made of, I went with a neutral gray color that won't draw attention away from the rest of the building. Next, I went over the stonework and roof with a thin dark wash. This is just black acrylic paint mixed with a lot of water, along with a few drops of brown to give it some character. Once the wash was done, I did some dry brushing. Here I've got barely any paint on the brush at all, and I'm just hitting the high points on the stonework. I also brush a few areas and even some specific stones a little more heavily than others to give the final result some barely noticeable variation for a more natural look. I painted the wall caps, or whatever these are called, with a lighter gray. For the doors and other woodwork, I used white with just a hint of brown and yellow. It still looks like white, The color just adds a little bit of dimension to it. I hit the steps with some lighter gray, but I made sure not to completely cover the darker color underneath. The doorknobs I based in a dark charcoal gray. I then went over this with a thin coat of brown. I finished them up by dry brushing with metallic bronze, lightened with a bit of white. Some of the dark base coat still shows through, giving it the look of old tarnished metal. I went over all the woodwork with a very thin black wash to bring out all those different layers. I also darkened the underside of the windowsills and any other overhanging areas. I decided that those light gray wall caps were too light and they stood out too much. It was distracting, so I went over them with a darker color. You can't really see the difference on camera, but I thought it looked much better. I also did a little bit more dry brushing on the walls here and there, and I fixed a few areas on the doors and the windows where the black wash had gotten too dark. None of the other buildings on this particular train layout are weathered much at all, so I didn't want this one to look out of place. Finally, I just used a little bit of black wash here and there to add some shadowing under the projecting surfaces. Off camera, I masked the windows with tape and gave it a quick coat of clear matte finish to protect the paint job. The last step was to add lights. I don't have trains myself, and I don't know how to wire lights for them. Also, I wanted this to be able to work as a standalone piece, on a shelf or whatever, so I used a string of battery-powered LEDs from the dollar store. I attached the wires to the ceiling with hot glue. This glue gun gets hot enough to cause burns, so I was careful to keep my fingers out of the melted glue. Off camera, I added a small partition made of chipboard, which keeps the battery pack from falling out while still letting it slide in and out to change the batteries. This was actually my first try at scratch building a scale model, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. I've got a variety of other projects planned, but I'm not really on a fixed schedule here, so expect me when you see me. Till then, thanks for watching, and here are the final results.